Bernadette asked me to say a few words about Chartres, which has been a center of my life for many years and is the sanctum sanctorum of Ubiquity University. It is where we have our mystery school. It is where we gather on an annual basis, and Chartres informs everything that we do as a university. Before getting into the story of Chartres, I want to ask a question that was beginning to formulate in my mind as Ingo was giving his splendid opening address this morning, and the youth were speaking to us about being human and humanism in a world in transition. I would like to push that theme a little deeper by asking the following question, since we're so close to Paris. Why is it that the city of Paris, unique in all the world, is infused with the erotic, sensual energy of the feminine? Why is it that France, unique in the world, has the symbol of Marianne, the personification of liberty and freedom, who during the French Revolution was vaunted up as the goddess of reason? Why is there so much extraordinary feminine energy in this place? Look at Bernadette. Perfectly coiffed. Beautiful in every detail. Quintessentially French. I come from California, and I can tell you the women don't dress like that in California. Only in France. When I was there over the last couple of days, it turned out to be Fashion Week. And I wandered around the streets, and there was all these extraordinary fashion models having their picture taken going into these various buildings. I'd like to, over the next few minutes, suggest an answer to these questions. And I would like to submit to you, Paris is an aftershock of where the feminine is very deep. And that is in a town that we're going to visit this afternoon. To the west, in Chartres. The story begins 3,500 years ago, 1500 BC, when the Celts, who up to that time had lived in Central Europe, swept into Western Europe, into what is now France, Belgium, Holland, Western Germany, up into the British Isles, led by the Druids. We had a Druidic ritual to start our proceedings last night. It was beautiful. The Druids were the spiritual, political, juridical leaders of the Celtic people. Druid actually comes from the term people of the oak. The Druids, as you may remember, never built a building because they believed that buildings were a sacrilege against the beauty of nature. Their spirituality occurred in the groves of the trees, by a rippling brook, by a beautiful lake on a mountaintop. Of all the spiritual indigenous people of Europe, the Druids were the most refined because their commitment to a harmonious relationship with nature was of such severity that even though they were literate, they never put anything down in writing. Everything was memorized. And the leader of the Druidic caste was called the voice. Through sound, the Druids opened up the intelligence of the trees. Through sound, the Druid would heal. Through sound, the Druids on special days of the year, the solstices, the equinox, would open up the portals between the visible and the invisible worlds. So the Druids understood nature at a very profound level. And when they came to this part of Europe, and they came to the hill of Chartres, what they found was a granite promontory jutting up on the top of a hill. And it was the hill itself was made of limestone. So you had the peculiar juxtaposition of the hardest stone and one of the most porous earth formations. And between the granite promontory and the limestone, they discovered a grotto, a cave. And when they entered into the cave, they discerned an extraordinarily powerful energy that they identified as the energy of a virgin expecting impregnation to bear a child. She was not with child. She was the heat of the passion of the feminine, waiting to be impregnated. And they said, "This is our Vatican." You know the term Vatican. We think of it in relationship to Rome and the Roman Church, the Vatican. Well, the Vatican is a Celtic word, not a Latin word. And the original use of the term Vatican had to do with Chartres. Because for the Druids, the energy formation in Chartres was the most powerful energy formation anywhere they could find anywhere in Europe. And it was feminine. And that is where they had their Vatican. And several times a year, particularly at the time in late October, early November, the eve of All Hallows, the Day of the Dead, when the veils between the worlds are particularly thin, all the Celtic people would gather in Chartres for ritual and celebration and counsel. And for 1,500 years, Chartres was the center of the Druidic Celtic world. And it is said that at one point they fashioned a Madonna, a black Madonna. They would bring the black Madonna out from the grotto on the spring equinox, put her on top of the promontory, and then in the fall equinox they would take her down into the grotto until the next spring. And then in 58 BC came the conquering general Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar, as you all know, over a period of about 6 to 8 years, conquered the entire land of Gaul. And Caesar, in his commentaries, wrote about the Druids. He records that the Druids had to study for 20 years before they were considered mature enough to become eligible to even study to become the voice. And it was the Druids with the young general Vercingetorix, who's still remembered in French history today, around Chartres, that mobilized the last stand of the Celts against Caesar. They massed an army of over 250,000 men. Caesar only had 40,000. So Caesar built a barricade with a wall, a moat 30 meters by 30 meters by 30 meters, and another wall, and a moat 30 meters by 30 meters by 30 meters. And the forces of Vercingetorix, with the Druidic power, attacked. But all the courage of the Celts and all the power of the Druids could not defeat the genius of Caesar. And it is said that at the end of the battle, Vercingetorix on a white horse circumnavigated the battlefield, rode up to Caesar, dismantled, and bent the knee. He was taken out in shackles when Julius Caesar went to Rome for his triumph. Vercingetorix was part of the parade, and then he was taken into a prison and strangled to death. And that was the end of the Celtic civilization in Gaul. And that's one reason why we think of the Celts today and the Druids as having to do with Great Britain. But in the beginning it was not so. But that telluric energy did not go away. And it is said that Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea came to France, went to Chartres, before Joseph of Arimathea went on to Glastonbury and in the British Isles, and Mary Magdalene stayed in France in the Bound Forest. And the Christians said, the Virgin, expecting impregnation, has had a child. And that child was Christ. So what the Christians did in Chartres is they transmuted that original Druidic awareness of the feminine to Mary Mother giving birth to the Christ child. And there grew up in Chartres a Christian church. And then in the 9th century, Charles the Bald, the grandson of Charlemagne, bequeathed to the Bishop of Chartres what they call the Sancta Camicia, which we'll see this afternoon, still in the cathedral. The veil that Mary was by tradition wearing when she gave birth to the Christ child. And there are many stories of that Sancta Camicia being used by the bishops in battle. One famous story that Chartres was surrounded by the Normans. And the bishop just held the veil of Mary up over the walls, and miraculously the Norman army melted away and Chartres was saved. But what began to incubate there over the centuries was the awareness that there was a particular feminine quality to Chartres. And then in 1006, just over 1,000 years ago, came an Italian monk called Fulbert, who at the request of his friend Pope Sylvester II, with whom he'd gone to school in Rheims, had asked Fulbert to go to Chartres. Fulbert was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. After he'd been bishop for several years, he got very, very ill. And in his deliriums of fever, when his students and his fellow administrators thought he was dying, he had a vision of Mary. And Mary came to him and bared her breast and leaned over to him and squeezed a single drop of milk into his mouth. And Fulbert woke up completely healed. And he dedicated the rest of his life to the adoration of Mary. And it was through Fulbert that for the first time in Christian history, they assigned a feast day to Mary. He wrote many hymns to Mary. And when we go to the cathedral this afternoon, I'll point out some of the windows. Because it was Fulbert that said it wasn't just Joseph that was of the line of and the seed of David. It was also Mary. Mary is of the seed of David. During his tenure, his church burnt down. So Fulbert began to build an even more grand church. And then 100 years after his death in 1194, there was another fire. And the entire cathedral burnt down, except for the western facade, which we'll see. The bishop came 3 days after the fire had smoldered. The Sancta Comisia was nowhere to be found. The populace was deeply in despair. And at the moment when the bishop was praying in this ritual of mourning, what emerged from the rubble but 3 priests holding the Sancta Comisia. When the fire had started, they grabbed it and gone down into the basement. And for 3 days, they just experienced the burning of the cathedral. Can you imagine being in the basement when a huge church in stone and wood like the Notre Dame fire, everything is tumbling down on top of you? And you're holding the most sacred relic in the entire city? When they came out, people experienced it as the resurrection. Because Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days, and then came the resurrection. And in a delirium of thanksgiving and an ecstasy of joy and gratitude that the Sancta Comisia had been spared, the city of Chartres, the people of France, in 28 years, which was a record for the building of Gothic cathedrals. The Gothic cathedral in Milan took over 450 years. Most of your Gothic cathedrals, the 200, 300 Gothic cathedrals, took centuries to build. The edifice that we're going to see this afternoon took 28 years to build. It is considered by some to be the most extraordinary masterpiece of architecture in the world, paralleled only by the Taj Mahal. Chartres is called the queen of the cathedrals. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, called Chartres the womb of the earth. And one of the most extraordinary things about Chartres is that right as you go into the western portal is this huge labyrinth. And people have walked the labyrinth. So sacred is the feminine in Chartres is that, again, almost unique among cathedrals. No one is buried there. And even in the centuries before the Christians came, among the Druids and the other peoples, no one was buried there because of the intensity of this virginal expectation of birth. The cathedral has over 450 depictions of the Madonna and Child. No one is buried there. And until very, very recently, there was hardly a cross in the entire cathedral because the theology of the Chartrian masters, starting with Fulbert, was a theology without original sin, but what Matthew Fox calls original blessing. That creation is good, we are good, and you can find God through the Bible. You can also find God through a flower, through a sunset, through the moonrise. Extraordinary thing is, after they built Chartres Cathedral between 1194 and about 1226, they disappeared. One of the most mysterious events in history. The Chartrian masters emerged, codified in stone and stained glass, the truths that they knew about the world. And then they just disappeared, hardly leaving a trace. Many, many centuries later comes the French Revolution. And Chartres was almost burnt down by the mobs, wanting to rip down the edifice of the Catholic Church. Remember Voltaire. Remember the crimes. Remember the crimes, he said. And in that frenzy, they came close to burning down Chartres Cathedral. They desecrated many of the statues. And then the architect who was there convinced them that they needed to think about it, that it's pretty difficult to burn down a big cathedral. They needed to have a plan. And over a few days, the frenzy dissipated and Chartres was saved. There's another very interesting story. At the end of World War II, remember the D-Day invasion? Patton, remember George Patton, was given the task by Eisenhower to take Western France. As he approached in August of 1944, his intelligence told him that German snipers were at the top of the cathedral and that the snipers were shooting at approaching Allied forces, so he gave the order to bomb the cathedral. And one of his colonels, a young man, knowing a little bit about Chartres, pleaded with him, don't bomb this cathedral. And he says, I will volunteer to go behind enemy lines and ascertain whether there is in fact snipers shooting from the bell towers. And Patton, uncharacteristically, said okay. The young man went in, verified there were no snipers, snuck back through, told Patton, and so Chartres was spared. And in one of the supreme ironies of the war, the very next week, that young colonel was shot and killed by the Germans in another battle around Chartres. But in that little twist of fate, the queen of the cathedrals was spared. In the 1960s, Jean Houston, most of you know Jean Houston, went to Chartres, and she declared at the beginning of the human potential movement, at the beginning of the transpersonal movement, at the beginning of everything that we're here celebrating 35 years of Eurotas, Stan Groff, she says Chartres, the labyrinth, is the epicenter. Because it's about the rising of the Madonna, the rising of the feminine, the rising of the women, and that the energy in Chartres is somehow connected with the world destiny at this moment in time. One of her students, a woman named Chartres, went to Chartres. And she learned that the church, since the French Revolution, had covered up the labyrinth. Because the labyrinth is pre-Christian. And they weren't sure what to do with the labyrinth, even though the Chartreuse masters had built it into the floor of the cathedral. So they covered it up with chairs. And Lauren Artress was a deaconess of a cathedral in San Francisco, Grace Cathedral. And there was a relationship between Grace Cathedral in San Francisco and Chartres Cathedral here. And Lauren asked the bishop to clear away the chairs so she could walk the labyrinth. He said no. So in an act of civil disobedience, Lauren Artress took away the chairs. And to the astonishment of the clergy, the utter astonishment of the bishop, Lauren Artress and her colleagues walked the labyrinth and reclaimed it, and it stays open to the present day. Although they only open it on Fridays. We came in October of 2005, shortly after I became president of the university, actually. We were doing a pilgrimage to the Black Madonna and Mary Magdalene sites of France. And we ended up in Chartres. While we were there, one of the students gave me René Carado's book, The Golden Age of Chartres, and I read that Fulbert had founded the Chartres Academy in 1006, and I realized 2006 was going to be the 1000th anniversary of Fulbert's Chartres Academy, and in an unbelievably passionate euphoria, eureka moment, I said, why don't we commemorate the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Chartres by recreating his 7 liberal arts? You hear about the liberal arts and the whole Western educational tradition. Those are started by Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle 2,500 years ago. And the Chartreuse masters for 200 years taught the 7 liberal arts. And what Ubiquity University through our Wisdom School has been doing for the last 14 years, starting in 2006, is every year we go to Chartres at the first week of July and we study one of the liberal arts. We just finished our 2nd cycle of 7 with Astronomica, which is the highest liberal art. It's about the astronomy, it's about the cosmos. We were just there a month ago with our largest and most successful class in the history of the school. When we go there today, we'll have a very short amount of time, but those of you who will go will bear witness to the extraordinary sophistication of the human spirit. And you'll witness one of the greatest architectural masterpieces ever built. And all they had was string, a pencil, a ruler, and a compass. There was no computer-aided design, and when you look at that unbelievable cathedral, it is something almost unimaginable that it could be done without any modern instrumentality. Let me conclude by making 2 points, coming back to my original question of why is Paris so infused by the feminine? It's because seeping up from the earth is a telluric energy, an earth energy. The Druids discerned 3,500 years ago, but it is just as potent today as it was then. And we don't have time right now, but I would like to submit to you that if you work out the implications of the fact that it is the earth and the energies coming from the earth that is shaping our humanity, has shaped the destiny and the identity of an entire city. The deeper identity that we need to grapple with is not just our humanity and humanism and the fact that animals may be intelligent. We are intelligent. Animals are intelligent because the earth is intelligent. We are not on some inert dirt. We are part of a living organism. The earth is alive. The earth is multi-intelligent. Every quality humans have, every quality you see in nature, every quality you see in a flower is there because it's a manifestation of earth. And something that we can consider is a new term. We've got to move way beyond humanism. We've got to move to earthism. We have got to come to the point in our history, my friends, where we no longer see ourselves not only as separate, but we are earth. We are part of an organism, and the question that we need to grapple with is humanity is here for a reason that we need to discern in terms out of a communication with the earth herself. That's Gaia. And that's actually a theory. You all know about James Lovelock and his work in the 1960s for NASA. He was the first human being to be given the task of looking at the earth from outer space. Nobody had ever looked at the earth from outer space before. And when he saw the atmosphere, and he saw the oceans, and he saw the whole ecosystem from a distance, he concluded, this thing's alive. You remember the story of Pinocchio? Remember Pinocchio, the little puppet And at one point in the story, Pinocchio goes through a storm and he's buffeted about and he ends up on a rock. And he's cold. So he lights a fire. And when the fire's lit, the rock begins to move. And he realizes he's not on a rock. He's on the back of a whale. That is the Copernican revolution in human consciousness today. We're not on a rock. We're on a whale. We were produced by the whale. And our chief task is to find out why. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't need this. Because I'm concluding. The second point I want to make is that to express deep, deep appreciation for Eurotas and for the integral, transpersonal movement. Because if I had to identify the metaphysical framing for our transition from human to humanism to earthism, it's the integral theory and the transpersonal. And that's what Ubiquity's doing with the Integral Transpersonal Institute of Pierluigi Lattuada. That's what Nora Cellini's doing here. We have a whole program in integral transpersonal psychology as a partnership of ITI and Ubiquity. Because we believe that the teachings, the philosophy, the spirituality that humanity needs to delve into as quickly and deeply and passionately and urgently as we can is an integral framework that is basically transpersonal. Because those young people that spoke to us earlier this morning, they're ground zero. We all know that we are running out of time. We all know that history is calling us into account. We all know that the accumulated trauma of generations after generations, divided, alienated, disconnected from nature, is now coming to a critical mass. And we owe it not only to our young, but to our future. There was a woman that said, what about 7 generations? We won't have 7 generations unless we give this next generation the mindset, the skill set, and the tool sets they need to come together to solve global problems. And that's why we're grounded in Chartres. Because the key to our shadow, the key to the solution that we seek, is through a deeper connection with the feminine that is seeping up through the earth into our consciousness and addresses us today. Thank you very much.